So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to take a look at a rather minor figure in young Earth creationism, but still one who has some wild things to say. He also has by far the best speaking voice of any creationist I've encountered. Unfortunately, in this video he seems to have used a noise gate, but not a noise filter, so when he speaks it's going to be with some white noise in there. Also, because of the noise gate, I couldn't really run noise reduction on it in post very easily, so basically I just normalized the sound, boosted the low and high end, and this is what we've got. It's not much, but it's something. Also, the aspect ratio was weird, so I cropped the video. Anyway, this is supposed to be about the age of the Earth, so let's go.
Strike number 2, mutation selection mechanism is effectively dead, according to Stephen Gould of Harvard.
Yes, this is indeed where the talk starts, with number 2. But let's talk about number 1 first. Macroevolution is impossible to observe. Attributed to Theodosius Dobzhansky. First, I have no idea if he said that, but it doesn't seem like something he would say. Searching for it only turned up creationist sources, but further, even if he had said it, we have indeed observed macroevolution, both in the lab and in the wild. Here are some examples. Drosophila fruit fly populations have been induced to undergo macroevolution in laboratories dozens of times, sometimes in under 20 generations. These experiments started back in 1969 and have continued on since. One of the people who did it first was, in fact, Theodosius Dobzhansky, the guy who, according to Kindle, said that this wasn't possible. Procambarus virginalis, the marbled crayfish, evolved in the 90s from Procambarus phallax, and it is now invasive in much of Europe. House mice were introduced in the Faroe Islands less than a millennium ago, and are already so morphologically distinct from other populations on mainland Europe that they are at least a new subspecies, and are well on their way to being a new species, if they're not there already. Currently, it is arguable whether or not hawthorn maggot flies have speciated with their sister lineage of apple maggot flies, both parasitize plants as larvae, and have separate gene pools now as a result of different breeding times, and are now genetically distinct. There are, of course, many other examples I have not listed. Further, as for point 2, I don't think Stephen Jay Gould said this, but whether or not he did, it's simply not true. Mutation and selection are still two of the most important aspects of evolution, so while Kindle might want to argue against their effectiveness is currently uncontested in evolutionary biology.
Who, at the time of his death in the early 21st century, was considered the leading spokesman for evolution.
By whom, and what does that even mean? Gould was a good science communicator, but he wasn't Pope of biology or anything. This is so weird to me.
And of course, random mutations destroys information, it doesn't make it better.
I guess he thinks that the upregulation of lactase expression later in life resulting in lactose tolerance in adulthood destroyed information. Kindle should probably stop eating dairy then. I also suppose the multiple gene duplications and subsequent mutations that allowed a group of notothenioid fish to get an antifreeze protein out of a trypsinogen protein, while retaining the original trypsinogen gene, somehow was a loss of information even though it resulted in a new beneficial protein without the loss of any ancestral gene. I guess the multiple mutations that allowed the simian immunovirus to leap to humans who were previously immune thanks to their weird tetherin protein was somehow a loss of function even though they gained a new function without losing any old functions, and also gained an entirely new and naive host population. It is trivially easy to find examples of mutations that neither destroy or scramble information while being beneficial. Kindle is either profoundly ignorant of the topic or is just lying. I'll let you decide which it is.
So natural selection can't select anything better if nothing better is being produced by the destructive mechanism.
Man, good thing the mechanism isn't simply destructive and we know from both mathematical modeling and real-world observation how it works. And that it doesn't work the way this guy thinks.
So that's strike number 2. Strike number 3, not a single watertight transitional fossil is known.
Well, fossils tend to be broken up a bit, and most organisms were never watertight to begin with, so that seems likely. I'm not sure why you'd want them to be watertight, though. Is he planning to use a transitional fossil as a cup or pot or something? That's not an appropriate use of any but the most common kinds of fossils.
According to Dr. Colin Patterson, a former senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History.
Weird how there's no citation, right? Like, for any of these? All we get is the name of the person who said these things, except in each case, only 1 or 2 words are in quotations, so we can't even say that they said these things, only the bits in quotation are claimed. There are basically no good reasons to do this, but I can think of a lot of bad reasons to do it.
And he wrote a book on evolution, and he didn't put a single example, either a drawing or a photograph of a transitional form. And when asked why, he said, well, if I knew of any that were legitimate, I certainly would have put them in my book.
So, fortunately for you, I happen to know about this one off the top of my head, because it's been a staple of creationism since the 90s and long before, despite the fact that it has been addressed since that decade. This goes back to the halcyon days of talk origins. The quote is from a personal letter from Patterson to a creationist, Luther Sunderland, and is about the former's book, Evolution, published in 1979. The book itself actually lists several transitional forms, including Hyracotherium, Archaeopteryx, and Ichthyostega. He also acknowledges that we cannot infer direct ancestry from transitional forms, which is indeed the widespread consensus in paleontology. In fact, this case was investigated by one Lionel Thunison, who actually reached out to Dr. Patterson about this. Let's read Dr. Patterson's response. Dear Mr. Thunison, sorry to have taken so long to answer your letter of July 9th. I was away for a while and then infernally busy. I seem fated continually to make a fool of myself with creationists. The specific quote you mentioned from a letter to Sunderland dated 10th of April, 1979, is accurate as far as it goes. The passage quoted continues, a watertight argument. The reason is that statements about ancestry and descendant are not applicable to the fossil record. Is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. There is no way of answering the question. It is easy enough to make up stories about how one form gave rise to another and to find reasons why the stages should have been favored by natural selection. But stories are not part of science, for there is no way to put them to the test. I think the continuation of the passage shows clearly that your interpretation at the end of your letter is correct and the creationists is false. That brush with Sunderland, I had never heard of him before, was my first experience with creationists. The famous keynote address at the American Museum of Natural History in 1981 was nothing of the sort. It was a talk to the systematics discussion group in the museum, an extremely informal group. I had been asked to talk to them on evolution and creationism, fired up by a paper by Ernst Mayr, published in Science just the week before. I gave a fairly rumbustious talk, arguing that the theory of evolution had done more harm than good to biological systematics classification. Unknown to me, there was a creationist in the audience with a hidden tape recorder. So much the worse for me. But my talk was addressed to professional systematists and concerned systematics, nothing else. I hope that by now I have learned to be more circumspect in dealing with creationists, cryptic or overt, but I still maintain that skepticism is the scientist's duty, however much the stance may expose us to ridicule. Yours sincerely, signed Colin Patterson. This, of course, is straight from Talk Origins, because that's how old this is, and how long ago we've known this is bullshit that misquotes Patterson.
But I don't think there are any that are watertight, that are really worth documenting in my book.
Except that he did document them in his book, a book Kindell has clearly not read. And further, as we've seen, what Patterson meant about being watertight was that he could not make a watertight case that any given transitional species was directly ancestral to a modern group. But of course, that doesn't matter. Their bare existence is predicted by evolution, and only really makes sense in terms of evolution.
Of course, if evolution were true, we should have boatloads in every museum. There should be so many transitions, but the handful that are there that they choose to argue about are simply not enough to make the case, and they're so questionable and equivocal that experts like Dr. Patterson don't even accept them, even though they're evolutionists.
I bet you know what time it is.
So 1, 2, 3 strikes and you're out, but the evolutionists claim they are exceptional.
Science isn't baseball. There's no set number of strikes. And further, none of these 3 strikes are even strikes. They're more like, Lies, I guess?
And it takes 4 strikes to get them out.
Whether it's 3, 4, or a million, we haven't seen one yet.
So the 4th strike they say they must be struck out on is number 4 here. The fossil strata relationship supposedly proves that evolution happened over ages of time.
I assume that by fossil strata relationships, he means faunal succession. The fact that the fossil assemblages of the sedimentary strata of the Earth change as you go up or down the stratigraphic column. This is why some creationists like Richard Owen or Hugh Ross accept the idea of progressive creation, where God creates different groups of organisms at various times on Earth. Why he does this isn't clear to me, but whatever, it's not my idea.
Even though we can't observe it happening, and it
Except that we do observe it routinely.
doesn't have a documented adequate mechanism,
It has several, including mutation, drift, and selection, to name the big 3.
and we don't have the transitional fossils to document it.
Don't make me pull out the yodeling again.
Supposedly, the progression from simple to more and more complex through the geological strata shows that life did evolve from simple to complex over geological time.
Yeah, basically. I'd quibble a bit with the fact that his phrasing makes it look like there's some evolutionary drive towards complexity, when this is not really true, but who cares?
The fossil strata relationship, therefore, would say that the lowest layer there, the lowest stratum, has the simplest form of life, and as you go higher up the scale, life gets more and more complex.
Well, the lowest fossil-bearing stratum, and in fact, the lowest fossils we find are stromatolites, collections of single-celled photosynthetic bacteria that form bulbous columns over time as newer generations build on the skeletons of their accumulated ancestors.
And that is, of course, how it is presented in the textbooks. In the textbooks, it looks very nifty and neat, everything in its place, everything agreeing with evolution.
It's so neat because this is explaining an abstract model, not the real world. Models are idealized. If you took physics in school, you probably had to answer questions where you were told to ignore friction, even though in the real world, friction exists. Similarly, the ideal gas laws assume that gases have no self-interaction among the atoms or molecules that make them up. This is obviously untrue, but I tell you what, when you discharge a CO2 fire extinguisher, the ideal gas law tells you that the gas that comes out will be cold, and so it will be. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Just like in physics and engineering, in order to make things easy to digest and work with, we make simplifications. The model of the stratigraphic column is idealized and presented without unconformities, reworked sections, and with only representative organisms. Models are inherently simplified, because if they weren't, then they would just be the real thing. A map is a simplified version of a place. It does not contain all the data you might need. The real place does, though. The stratigraphic column is a map to the geology of the Earth, but as a model, it will never contain everything about the geology of Earth that is true. We yet again have an instance where creationists show that they neither understand nor appreciate science.
And they even put Greek names of those various ages to make it sound scientific.
That was just the convention when these rocks were first described. And remember that fundamentally, these names are the names for rock systems, and the names for the time periods associated with them only exist because the rocks exist. The reason Greek and Latin were used is because when geology was invented in Europe, most educated men, and women were largely excluded from science at the time, had a working understanding of both Greek and Latin, because the classics were a core part of basically every curriculum in every school on the continent, as well as many schools in the colonial territories controlled by European powers. Therefore, using these languages ensured widespread understanding of the scientific terms. Since then, it has become something of a tradition to use these languages, although I am happy to report that scientists are increasingly using other languages, including native languages of the people groups who live in the areas of the new discoveries. I, as a non-linguist, would love to see more linguistic diversity in science.
Such as Paleozoic means ancient life, Mesozoic means intermediate life, and Cenozoic means recent life.
That's true.
At the very bottom, you have Archaeozoic, meaning archaic life, and Proterozoic, meaning the prototypes or the earliest, some of the earliest life forms.
Yep.
The problem with this, of course, is that nobody observed this happening.
Oh no, there's no eyewitness evidence. The worst kind of evidence. Ignore all the actual hard physical data. No one was there to write it down. Do people still actually buy this bullshit? That there was no one there to muddy the waters with their potentially dishonest and definitely faulty memory isn't exactly a problem.
This is a circumstantial evidence of fossils.
That neatly meets the predictions of evolutionary biology, when it didn't need to if evolution were wrong, making it a confirmed prediction. And of course, the radiometric dating, the stratigraphic dating, and the sedimentation experiments that real geologists doing real science have done are not circumstantial.
We don't find a complete column anywhere.
And it's a model. It was never supposed to perfectly reflect real life. If I ask you to arrange some letter-shaped fridge magnets in alphabetical order, but there's no B, no W, and no U, does that mean you can't do it, or that the alphabet is actually fake? No. If a period of time resulted in no net deposition in a particular place, then it won't be represented by rocks in that place, and there will be an unconformity. There is no reason to expect net deposition in all places for all times. In fact, it's impossible. Deposition in one place is only possible because of erosion and sediment transport from somewhere else, which means that some places have to be net eroding during any time if there is to also be sediment deposition anywhere on Earth during that time. Fundamentally, deposition and erosion have to be balanced because one causes the other. It's like Kindell doesn't know about the rock cycle, which is weird, because I'm pretty sure I learned that in, middle school.
In fact, you couldn't. If this column that we see in our textbooks and our museums actually existed as a physical structure, it would not fit in the crust of the Earth.
What the fuck is he talking about? There's no rule about how thick a given stratum has to be. If you have 3 millimeters of Jurassic rock, you have Jurassic rock. Of course it could fit. It would just have to be composed of very thin layers, but so what? Even if he were right, it was never required to fit in the first place. That's not the point of the model. The model is there so you know which rocks come above and below which other rocks, so that when you're actually doing geology or paleontology, you know what the heck you're doing, and also where to look for what you want to find. Evolutionary biology and the stratigraphy of Earth are used together to tell paleontologists where to dig to find new specimens that they're looking for. If it didn't work, they couldn't make successful predictions, and their future funding for grants is at least in part dependent on their ability to get results. Results they wouldn't get if they couldn't use these models to make successful predictions. And of course, it's not just pure science that depends on these models being useful. Oil exploration does too. Oil exploration depends on basin modeling to find places where oil is likely to be found, since drilling a dry well can be financially devastating. Basin modeling depends on dating rocks correctly, which is done with a combination of radiometric and stratigraphic techniques. If these models were not reasonably accurate to the real world, then they wouldn't work, and oil companies wouldn't use them.
Because they admit it would be nearly 100 miles deep.
What I believe is dumb.
Who said that? Where did he say it? Was it no one and nowhere? I bet that's the real answer.
And the Earth's crust averages only about 25 miles deep on the average. It wouldn't even fit.
Cool story, bro. But is there a point to this whole thickness debate? Maybe Kindell just has a thing for skinny rocks. I don't know.
So how do they get this thing to be hypothetically nearly 100 miles deep?
Given that they didn't, I don't even know what he's talking about. But hey, let's find out.
Well, they do it by assuming certain things that they've never proven. They assume that evolution is a fact.
Evolution is a fact the same way that the Earth being a globe is a fact. It's been directly observed in real time by humans, and it also forms the basis for numerous models of the real world that make accurate predictions about future data. The only real difference is that it's harder for the average Joe to find the evidence for evolution than it is for him to find the evidence of the globe. But both are firm conclusions of science on the same basis, confirmed predictions and direct observations and measurements.
Even though it is mathematically, chemically, physically, and thermodynamically impossible.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Well, we haven't been given any reason to think that, and no one has managed to convince the actual scientific community that it's impossible. Plus, the fact that we see evolution happening all the time seems to negate the idea that it's impossible. It's like saying that gravity is impossible. All the while, things continue to fall down and orbit as predicted by the law of gravity.
Who cares about the facts of science? They want to believe something, so they do, and they call it a fact.
Imagine being a guy who decides to cherry-pick the parts of Genesis that line up with his theology literally, while ignoring blatant contradictions and the flat earth implications of Genesis, then deciding that this must represent the real history of the world at the outset, and then accusing the real scientists who do not do this of having a conclusion-first methodology. There's this word that Kindell would do well to look up. It's projection. As a reminder that creationists are conclusion-first kinds of guys, let's just double-check what is required to submit a paper to the Answers Research Journal, the blog of Answers in Genesis that pretends to be peer-reviewed. Their manual for submission contains the line, "Working with your editor builds an effective partnership whose goal is to ensure that the creation and flood model is given the best possible development by all concerned." Their About page says, ARG disseminates research conducted by creationists experts in theology, history, archaeology, anthropology, biology, geology, astronomy, and other disciplines of science by providing readers with the results of cutting-edge research that demonstrates the validity of the young Earth model, the global flood, the non-evolutionary origin of created kinds, and more, showing how science is consistent with and confirms the biblical account of origins in Genesis. Gee, seems like creationism is full of conclusion first, evidence second, if at all, thinkers.
Much like our fake news tells all kinds of facts that aren't true.
I'll avoid overt political commentary other than to say, mors tyranno orantio, and may it be soon.
Nothing new under the sun.
Yay for Ecclesiastes reference. I like that book.
Because they assume evolution, and they assume that life progressed, and they assume also there were many millions of years of erosion taking place during all this time.
Those are conclusions, not just assumptions, although since they are very strong and so far never successfully contested conclusions, they are indeed simply used as assumptions in later research. You know, because that's how science works.
That certain fossils, which are extinct today, which they claim represent a certain stage of evolution, a classic example being trilobites.
Trilobites can be decent index fossils, but I wouldn't say they represent a certain stage of evolution, especially since they went extinct at the end of the Paleozoic and left no living descendants, so they aren't part of the evolutionary lineage of any living thing.
In some strata, you may find them, and they're only maybe a few feet thickness. In other areas, they might be hundreds of feet thick, the strata that contain these extinct trilobite fossils.
Man, he should have thought about that when he was saying stupid things like, the column couldn't fit in the crust of the Earth. Strata are not all of the same vertical thickness.
They assumed that the thickest layers where you find them anywhere in the world somehow escaped erosion.
Well, every layer that we find until now has escaped erosion to the extent it still exists, since if it eroded away, it wouldn't be here. It's like saying everyone alive today has somehow escaped electrocution. Yeah, if they hadn't, they'd be dead. Like, what kind of statement is this? It's basically just a tautology. But further, many layers have in fact eroded somewhat. It's just not entirely. Surprise Canyon is a paleo canyon that's exposed in the Grand Canyon. It itself is an erosional feature that shows that the layers it cut through were partially eroded. And the Grand Canyon itself then eroded through both those layers and the canyon infill layers. What are we even talking about here? Kendall seems to have the kind of knowledge of geology I might expect from a squirrel whose head was stepped on by a human.
That in most places it got eroded over millions of years, but here and there, portions of it escaped erosion, and so it was at least that thick in the past and probably thicker.
Yup, there are places where net erosion isn't positive, and that can persist for a long time. I'm not sure what the point of this is.
Since probably at least some of it was eroded.
Something we know happens, since we can see erosional features deep in the sedimentary record of the planet. Surprise Canyon being just one famous and very obvious example.
So they take the thickest layers that they can find globally with these extinct fossils that they assume belong in different evolutionary stages, and they superimpose them on paper. So you get the thickest layers, put them one on top of another on paper. By the time they end up doing that, the column ends up being nearly 100 miles deep.
I have no idea what the hell he's talking about. Is this a dream he had one day? No one superimposes thick layers on paper. What the hell would the point of that be? Who cares how thick they are? Instead, what happens is that scientists note that certain fossils are always found above or below other fossils, and that these fossils are restricted to certain layers, which are dated both relatively with stratigraphy and absolutely with things like radiometric dating. Then these are put down as a model in order where each rock system is included, even though very few places exist where all the rock systems are present. This is then arranged vertically, since that's usually how you find strata in real life, and presented as a model so that geologists and paleontologists can orient themselves temporally in relation to the rocks they're working in. In fact, even on the chart he has, the thickness is representative of the duration of these periods as measured radiometrically, which does not correlate to their physical thickness. So even his own chart shows his idea to be basically made up. I have no idea where he got this idea. I suspect, though, that when he found it, it was covered in human fecal matter, and that if DNA tested, would match his own DNA.
And of course would not even fit in the crust of the Earth as a physical reality.
He said only seconds after noting that the thickness of the strata of the Earth vary, thereby making the statement incoherent, even if it wasn't already completely inconsequential, even if true.
So this is purely a mental abstraction, a hypothetical reconstruction.
Young Earth creationists both fail to understand the very basics of science and also hate science, exhibit 3,093,210b.
And then the main problem with it is that they start with the assumption of evolution.
Nope, that was developed primarily by creationists who lived and worked mostly before Darwin. Granted, they weren't Kendall's flavor of creationist, being mostly day-agers, gap theorists, or progressive creationists, but they were not part of any biological evolution community. And early on, the geologists tended to oppose evolution because they thought the Earth was in fact too young for evolution. Turns out, though, that since they were not basing their conclusions on the Bible, Even when they were creationists, their models were robust enough to persist despite the academic triumph of evolutionary theory in academia. Probably because their models actually reflect important aspects of reality with reasonable utility and accuracy.
The fossil record is very mixed up. We often have fossils that are supposed to be old, on top of ones that are supposed to be young.
Sure would be cool if we had an example of this. An actual out-of-place fossil. Of course, he also went with the dumbest version of this by pointing to supposedly old fossils in young strata. The problem is that nothing about evolutionary biology demands that a particular group go extinct. The assessment of the extinction of an ancient organisms is based on their disappearance from the fossil record. Finding a fossil after the supposed extinction of the group just means that we were wrong about when that group went extinct, and at least one lineage managed to make it to the time that the new fossil was found. This has literally nothing to say about evolution. What would be far more profound would be a fossil much too early. I'm not talking about a bird in the late Triassic when before we thought they originated in the Jurassic. I'm talking about a bird before our first evidence of tetrapods, like in the early Devonian. Now that would be a problem, because that's basically a derived dinosaur before land vertebrates even seem to have existed. What we really need is what should be young organisms embedded in old rocks, and for this to be accomplished without reworking, since if the strata are disturbed such that young rocks have fallen into some crevice or other opening, that can make it superficially appear like a young fossil in old rock. Of course, we can test for reworking. If the allegedly reworked sediment is non-uniform in the direction of deposition, or it is significantly chemically different from the surrounding rock, etc., that is good reason to think that the sediment was reworked, and therefore naive stratigraphy can't be used to date the fossil. And if Kendall wants to say that that isn't a real thing, he'll have to explain the fact that reworking happens right now. We can see it happen. What would make such things impossible in the past? I can't think of anything.
And we find this many, many times. They say that overthrusting put them in the wrong order, but almost all the time there's no physical evidence to corroborate the theory of overthrusting.
Yes, there is. Here, look at these pictures of rocks with very obvious signs of overthrusting. If he wants to posit instances where rocks have been said to be overthrust without any evidence, he's accusing geologists of fraud, which means he should produce evidence. What specific allegedly overthrust rock does he think are actually in situ? My guess is that he has no such specific rocks. Won't bother to dive into any specifics, and will simply continue on after having accused basically an entire field of science of fraud. Let's see if he proves me wrong.
It just doesn't conform to what evolution says.
I mean, even if he's right, that's not clear since he went with the exact opposite scenario that would be problematic for evolutionary biology. Creationists have a knack for getting everything as wrong as possible. They really are just like flat earthers with a bigger budget, aren't they?
So they use the priority of the paradigm. In other words, evolution must be true, and any evidence that contradicts it will have to be reinterpreted to force it to fit. If it's too difficult to force it to fit, it will simply be called anomalous.
You know what? Let me remind you of something I said earlier. Imagine being a guy who decides to cherry-pick the parts of Genesis that line up with his theology literally, while ignoring blatant contradictions and the flat earth implications of Genesis, then deciding that this must represent the real history of the world at the outset, and then accusing the real scientists who do not do this of having a conclusion-first methodology. There's this word that Kendall would do well to look up. It's projection. As a reminder that creationists are conclusion-first kinds of guys, let's just double-check what is required to submit a paper to the Answers Research Journal, the blog of Answers in Genesis that pretends to be peer-reviewed. Their manual for submission contains the line, "Working with your editor builds an effective partnership whose goal is to ensure that the creation and flood model is given the best possible development by all concerned." Their About page says, ARG disseminates research conducted by creationists experts in theology, history, archaeology, anthropology, biology, geology, astronomy, and other disciplines of science by providing readers with the results of cutting-edge research that demonstrates the validity of the young Earth model, the global flood, the non-evolutionary origin of created kinds, and more, showing how science is consistent with and confirms the biblical account of origins in Genesis. Gee, seems like creationism is full of conclusion-first, evidence-second, if at all, thinkers. Yeah, it's really not the scientists who are doing conclusion-first work here.
And it will be censored because we don't want the public to be confused by things that might make them think evolution is not true. After all, we all know it's a fact.
And of course, we have no examples of such censorship forthcoming, whereas creationists just openly say that they won't publish things that don't support their conclusions. This is the pot calling the kettle black when the kettle is in fact chrome.
So this column was erected based on the assumption evolution is true in the first place, and millions of years is true in the first place, and yet it's used as the main proof for evolution and millions of years.
It was in fact constructed without absolute dating, and even before evolution was widely accepted. And it was done primarily by people who believed in divine special creation. Heck, even Lyell, the guy who basically invented uniformitarianism, was famously skeptical of Darwin's ideas, even though they were friends and he encouraged Darwin to publish.
Now, you don't have to know much about logic to realize that's a textbook fallacy known as circular reasoning.
I know my interpretation of the Bible is literally true because the people who publish creationist papers refuse to publish contradictory information, because they believe it's true too. And if it weren't true, there'd be stuff published in the creationist literature about that. So the Bible is true because the people who say it's true say so. Yeah, it's definitely the scientists with their statistics, hypothesis testing, data gathering, and peer review who are the ones doing the circular reasoning. And no, you don't actually need any examples of any of the things that the scientists are allegedly doing wrong. Some guy with a baritone voice says they're doing it wrong. You wouldn't disbelieve someone who kinda sounds like Darth Vader, would you? Of course not.
Where you use the theory to prove the theory. Use the assumption that the theory is true to interpret the evidence so that it always confirms the theory.
No one is doing that, because no one is trying to prove evolution. Just like no one is trying to prove that gravity exists, or atomic theory in chemistry, or the globe shape of the Earth. That evolution is true is a debate from over a century ago, and it's a debate that evolution has won and which has yet to be reopened, because no one who wants to reopen it has anything to bring to the table. So yes, evolution is now assumed to be true by biologists, geologists, and paleontologists. Just like the existence of atoms is assumed by chemists, gravity is assumed to exist by structural engineers, and the fact that the Earth is a globe is assumed by meteorologists.
Because any evidence that contradicts the theory is held to be illegitimate, because after all, we already know the theory is true.
Or, now hear me out, the people who base all their ideas about science on a book that says that having animals drink and mate in front of stripy sticks makes their offspring stripy, maybe aren't actually bringing any good evidence to the table, and so far, there really hasn't been any compelling evidence against evolution. That's at least a bare possibility, I think.
But if you use the theory to build the column, and then use the column to prove the theory,
which isn't even close to what happened, but hypotheticals are fun.
It's really using the theory to prove the theory.
Yeah, that sure would be. Good thing that the column was invented by creationists then, so we don't have to worry about that problem.
Yeah, that is classical circular reasoning. You might as well just say evolution is true because we assume it's true, and we're going to use that assumption to build this column.
Welcome to Dinosaur News at Noon on the Dinosaur News Network. My name is Vishanti, and our top story tonight comes from the internet. Scientists had long thought that the minimum level of self-awareness was 0, but recently creationists have shown that it can, in fact, be negative.
And then, of course, the column will be a self-fulfilling prophecy because it has to conform to what evolution predicts, even though there are many fatal contradictions.
Wouldn't it be fun, now that we're well into the video, if he bothered to give us any, actual ones that hold up to scrutiny and aren't just lies? Of course he won't, because, spoiler, there aren't any.
Now then, one of the most powerful contradictions that really fatally destroys the theory is the finding of advanced mammals.
I think he said mammals, but I'm not sure.
For example, with the dinosaurs, mammals that were not supposed to have existed with the dinosaurs and were not supposed to have evolved until millions of years after all the dinosaurs went extinct.
Mammals evolved in the Jurassic. Unless we're seeing actual rats or chimpanzees in the Cretaceous or something, the bare existence of mammals with non-avian dinosaurs is to be expected. So I guess it's just going to be a series of straw men of evolution at this point. That's fun.
If they're found together, then basically it supports the Bible.
No, it doesn't. It just fails to contradict the Bible. This isn't a dichotomy.
But these animals were created at the same time, the same week of creation in the beginning. They lived together in the same world. They got buried by the same flood.
Then we should actually expect to see things like elephants in the Permian. We should find whales in the Cambrian. We should find birds in the Carboniferous. We don't.
And therefore, of course, although there are different ecological zones.
Yep, fossil assemblages aren't divided up just ecologically, but also following a vertical pattern that does not map onto ecology. The deserts of the Permian had animals like Scutosaurus and Gorgonops, but it lacked animals like elephants and camels, even though ecologically they should have fit right in with that environment. Similarly, the seas of the Cretaceous had mosasaurs, but not whales. So while across the horizontal section, yes, fossils are grouped by ecological zone, that falls apart when you realize that the zones are inconsistent vertically, and that vertically, within any given ecological zone, the fauna still exhibit turnover in ways that only evolution can explain. And creationism can't really even accommodate. There's a reason that creationists don't touch biogeography, let alone paleobiogeography.
And therefore, with the flood, you would predict a general order from simple to complex based on ecological zonation. There would also be many mix-ups.
Why would that be the prediction? Ocean life isn't characteristically simple. Many highly complex organisms live in the ocean. In fact, I'm not sure how he could say that a swordfish is more or less complex than, say, a moose. Or for that matter, how a trilobite is less complex than, say, a dragonfly. But even if he thinks mammals are the height of animal complexity, there are mammals in the ocean too, or did he forget about dugongs and whales? And that's just the full-time ocean-dwelling mammals. If we include all the ones who spend considerable time in the water, we have to add in the sea otters and the pinnipeds, and to some degree even polar bears. If the flood started with burying marine ecosystems, we should find modern complex vertebrates in the lower shallow marine strata in places like the Cambrian. But we don't. Further, the typical fossils should actually change their ecology as we go up the stratigraphic column, but there are marine lacustrine and fluvial environments from top to bottom. How did the marine sediments containing trilobites all end up below the marine sediments with mosasaurs, which are all below the sediments with whales? And how did those three sets of marine deposits end up sandwiched with terrestrial fauna between them? Were the mosasaurs actually hill mosasaurs and the whales actually alpine cetaceans? See, this only makes sense if you just don't think about it and don't actually know what's in the fossiliferous strata of the Earth.
It'd also be because of the complex currents involved in these floods, a mixing of the ecological zones, and you would find modern-type mammals with dinosaurs predictably.
Cool, but we don't find that. I agree that we should if the global flood myth were historical rather than literary, but we don't find that. We find primitive mammals in the Mesozoic, generally small, mostly insectivorous, nocturnal things that if you saw them would probably remind you of a shrew, but are no more a shrew than you are, unless you watching this are also a shrew. Shrews are welcome here. I just suspect most shrews aren't avid YouTube watchers. But I don't know you. You do you. There are no Cretaceous beavers, badgers, bats, bison, barbarousas, baboons, bears, bandicoots, or binturongs. But if they all existed alongside the non-avian dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, there should be.
They declared it's very rare, and if it is, it's an anomaly, and it's not worth talking about, but it turns out to be very common.
Wow, that's interesting. It sure would be nice if we got an example. You know, a fossil that we can look up. Something like a pangolin in the Permian, or a giraffe in the Jurassic, or a cat in the Cretaceous.
It's just that the fake news has been hiding it.
Yes, of course.
Fake news.
Yeah, that's it. Of course, the news has nothing to do with it, since such examples would be reported primarily in the paleontology literature, not the nightly news. So, where are the papers? Also, he is just suggesting that the reason he has no evidence is a conspiracy. But that doesn't help him. We still need to see the evidence of the first claim, these alleged out-of-place fossils, but now we also need to see evidence of the conspiracy. Making up a conspiracy always makes you less believable, never more believable. It's a really bad move, unless of course you actually do have the evidence, in which case it's not made up and you should present it.
But Dr. Carl Werner is an MD, not a PhD, and usually medical doctors can make a whole lot more money than the average PhD physicist or scientist or whatever. And with his money, he and his wife traveled around the world. He wanted to write a book and do a video series on fossils that look the same today as they do in the fossil record.
Yes, the Harun Yahya bit of pointing to a fossil, pointing to an animal, often ones that are actually nothing alike, and then pretending that they're actually identical. It's barely a step above presuppositional apologetics in terms of how good of an argument it is. And presuppositional apologetics is the lowest form of argument I can even imagine.
Although their counterparts in the fossil record are supposedly many millions of years old.
And asking where the evolution is does nothing to change those age estimates.
And yet they look the same today. Apparently evolution just didn't work for them somehow.
So, a couple things. First, that's assuming that the fossil organism even is what is claimed, which often it's not. And that the modern organism is what is claimed, which often it's not. But second, some lineages are under stabilizing selection. You see, there are three basic kinds of natural selection: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. Directional selection is what most people think of when they think of natural selection. Some aspect of the environment induces a particular change in a population. This is the kind of selection that the famous peppered moths underwent in England during the Industrial Revolution. The trees got darker, and so darker colored moths were less likely to be eaten because they were harder to spot. This caused the population to be more often melanistic or black. Disruptive selection is similar, but more than one change is favored, pushing parts of the population in different directions over time. An example is sneaky males in some cuttlefish. In species with sneaky males, there are two types of males: the large ones who fight for territorial dominance and have harems, and the small ones who are about the same size as the females and who pose as females in the harem in order to mate with some of the actual females in the harem. Both large size and small size is favored, but intermediate size means losing dominance fights and not getting a harem, but also being unable to mate by sneaking into a harem. so medium-sized males are selected against. A hypothetical example might be a species of rat being preyed upon by owls. If they are smaller, then they are harder to notice and have an easier time escaping into small burrows or other hiding places. But conversely, perhaps some rats are big enough that they are not seen as prey by the owls, or can effectively injure the owls, causing them to be released. In this case, some rats will evolve to be smaller, or some larger, which may eventually cause the two groups to speciate. Finally, stabilizing selection occurs when an organism is highly adapted to its environment such that any members with significantly variant traits are lower fitness, and so natural selection serves to eliminate novelty in the population. Some lineages have stable niches and are highly adapted to them, like many decapods, xiphosaurans, and chondrichthyes. We should expect to see examples of all types of natural selection in the fossil record, and cherry-picking the examples of stabilizing selection does nothing to undermine the theory of evolution.
Yeah, so in doing his research, he traveled, over 100,000 miles around the world, flying to different dinosaur dig sites, and just saying, I'm a medical doctor, but I'm interested in paleontology. I'm wanting to write a book on it. And I'd like to just help you dig and excavate these dinosaur fossils here and see what's going on. And so I'll have, background research to write my book and everything.
So he lied. Now, granted, it was a lie by omission, but still a lie. A person lies, in my opinion, when he or she undertakes any action designed to convince another person of something the first person believes not to be true. So Werner, according to Kindell, went around convincing paleontologists that he was working on a book about paleontology, when in fact he was working on a book attacking paleontology, which is not at all the same thing. Good to know that the tradition of lying to support young Earth creationism is going strong.
And they were glad to have him help and everything, but what he found was amazing. What was really going on, what they were really finding. So he said, we looked only at the fossils found in the dinosaur dig sites, so that scientists who support evolution could not suggest that the fossils we looked at were not quote-unquote old.
Seems like a reasonable step. If you want to show that something was living with non-avian dinosaurs, going to a fossil site with non-avian dinosaurs would be step one. Well done, Carl.
We found fossilized examples of every major animal phylum living today.
Well, first, no, they didn't, because there are no known rotifers until the Cenozoic, as far as I can tell. Even though I am sure they were around during the Mesozoic. But further, basically every phylum evolved sometime in the Cambrian, or maybe the Ordovician, since bryozoans are unknown before the Ordovician. Since that's long before the Triassic, when the first dinosaurs show up, it would be weird if every animal phylum wasn't around, since they had already evolved. But also, I highly doubt he found any ornithophorans, or poriferans, or platyhelminthes. Maybe that's why he went with major phyla, because then he gets to just say whichever ones he actually found were the major ones.
Including birds and mammals.
Well, first, yeah, they evolved in the mid-Jurassic, so I would expect them to be found in mid- and late Jurassic, as well as Cretaceous layers well known for non-avian dinosaurs. But also, those are the same phylum, Chordata. Does Thomas Kindell, or maybe just Carl Werner, not know what a phylum is?
And not primitive birds and mammals, but some of the most highly evolved type that were not supposed to exist with the dinosaurs, according to their own theory.
That's not true, but I do at least now know where other creationists get their weird talking point that there are Mesozoic avocets, penguins, and parrots. It seems like it's probably from this book. In fact, on checking, yes, the exact list of birds that both AIG and Genesis Apologetics have used are found in Werner's books, with lorikeets, flamingos, cormorants, sandpipers, and loons being reported from the Lance Formation, and avocets, albatross, ducks, owls, and seagulls from the Hell Creek. First, both the Lance and Hell Creek are from the very end of the Cretaceous, long after many birds had evolved, including within modern groups such as Chiratiformes, Galliformes, Anseriformes, and various paleognats, etc. Several Chiratiforms, or possible Chiratiforms, are known from the Lance Formation, and other Chiratiforms include modern plovers, sandpipers, gulls, terns, and auks. But none of the Lance Formation Chiratiforms have been shown to be in any of the 19 modern families. Similarly, there is at least one species of fowl, but it might actually be basal to the split between water and ground fowl. And there are some proto-pelicans, but they're just that. They're basal to true pelicans. So if you want some bird evolution, it's right there in the Lance Formation. The Hell Creek is similar. There are no modern birds in either place, but there are animals in groups that still exist. But the problem is that all modern groups of organisms have ancestors that lived in the Cretaceous. So if you pick any modern animal, you can find examples of members of at least some taxon to which it belongs at any point in the past, including the Cretaceous. It's just that as you go back in time, you may have to move up the taxonomy so that by the time you're in, say, the Miocene, you might be finding members of the same family. In the Cretaceous, it might be the same order. In the Triassic, it might be the same class, and in the Ordovician, it might be the same phylum. That is what evolution would predict, and just pretending that basal members of modern groups are the same as modern animals doesn't change that. It just makes one a liar, and Carl Werner is a liar.
He said, contrary to popular belief, modern types of birds have been found, including parrots, owls, penguins, ducks, loons, albatross, cormorants, sandpipers, avocets, etc.
Except that that's not true. Members of larger clades to which these birds belong have been found, and that's what we should expect. What Werner is doing is fundamentally no different than saying that we have humans in the Triassic and using Probainognathus as your example, because humans and Probainognathus are both cynodonts. Or saying that we have Cambrian elephants because Pikaia and elephants are both chordates. It's either a profound stupidity that is hard to believe could exist in an MD, or it's a lie. And since Werner was apparently asking actual paleontologists about this, and they were certainly not telling him these modern animals were found in the Cretaceous, I suspect it's the latter.
When scientists who support evolution disclosed this information during our TV interviews,
which isn't a thing that happens, but okay,
it appears they could hardly believe what they were saying on camera. And in fact, their admissions on camera that they did, in fact, with him find these advanced birds with the dinosaurs is sufficient to destroy the theory.
So I went to Kendall's source for this, and the only citation in support for this is that one Tom Stidham found a jawbone that he interpreted as a parrot, which is in line with genetic studies done a decade later that recovered a Cretaceous divergence time for Psittaciformes and Falconiformes. But could Stidham assign the jaw to any modern extant parrot taxon? No, of course not. So we go from the published peer-reviewed literature that says that there were some ancient parrots in the Cretaceous, which is in line with later genetic studies, to Werner's interpretation that there were modern lorikeets in the Cretaceous, a completely unsupported claim.
They simply can't be that wrong and still have any credibility.
Well, I think I found a clip to use in the future.
He went on to say, at the dinosaur dig site, scientists have found fossilized mammals.
Well, obviously,
that look like squirrels, possums, Tasmanian devils, hedgehogs, shrews, beavers, primates, and duck-billed platypus.
Oh, looks like the mating call of the conspiracy loon. Yeah, lots of things look like things. This cliff looks like a guy. This island looks like a dolphin. This rock looks like an elephant. This toast looks like Jesus. This chimpanzee looks like a guy who lies to children. This cave looks like a vagina. The canyon looks like a lightning bolt. This non-mammal looks like a beaver, etc. That doesn't mean that those things are the things they look like. If you want to find things in the fossil record that kinda look like modern things, that's easy, because animals with similar lifestyles tend to resemble each other superficially, despite being only very distantly related. There's a reason that dolphins look like sharks, and it's not because they're sharks. Similarly, if you find a proto-mammal that lives in rivers, it shouldn't be a surprise that it shares traits with modern actual mammals that live in similar places in similar ways. But that doesn't mean you found the actual modern animal.
No, I highlighted the word primates because that means of the prime order. The primary, the most highly evolved creatures ever produced in the history of evolution are the primate.
Evolution isn't a ladder. Primates aren't more evolved than other orders of mammals. The name was selected by Carolus Linnaeus, who was a creationist and thought that since humans were primates, that the primates were the highest form of mammals, and since he believed in a version of the great ladder of being, in which humans are only a bit below the angels who are just below God, that means that primates must be the greatest or first in importance in all of the orders of mammals. But evolutionary biology does not hold to some great ladder of being. Indeed, that idea has been rejected in evolutionary biology for about a century now. The name is just a holdover from Linnaeus, and its etymology does not factor into modern ideas about the evolution of primates.
So that includes things like lemurs, monkeys, apes, and even man is considered a primate.
that's true.
So these things were not supposed to be anywhere near the dinosaurs. They were supposed to be evolved many millions of years after the dinosaurs went all extinct.
Well, the oldest known primate is Purgatorius, and it was found in Paleocene rocks from about 2 or 3 million years after the end of the Cretaceous, which means that primates probably diverged from colugos right around the end Cretaceous, and the split between colugos and primates as a group, the Euarchontans, and the gliers, or lagomorphs plus rodents, probably happened sometime just before the end of the Cretaceous. Of course, it would be nice to know specifically which fossil Werner, and through him Kendall, thinks was a Mesozoic primate. I would contend that there is no such fossil.
And to find things like primates is absolutely fatal to the theory of evolution.
I mean, primates are a group of mammals, and mammals evolved in the Jurassic. So from the outset, without any fossil or genetic data for primates directly, I would expect that they would show up anytime after that. They did in fact show up after that, and not, it seems, until after the non-avian dinosaurs were gone. This is very frustrating. If I told you that an organism existed in, say, the Jurassic, say the oldest known therian mammal, that is the group to which kangaroos and humans belong, but that excludes the platypus, I would tell you that it's Jeremiah. And if you wanted to know who found the fossil and where, etc., I would point you to the paper A Jurassic Eutherian Mammal and Divergence of Marsupials and Placentals by Luo et al., published in Nature on August 24, 2011. If you say a fossil organism existed and you can't name it and give at least some peer-reviewed description of it, then there's no reason anyone should even think it exists. The fact that Kindell can't do this should be a red flag.
But of course, it does not get reported. It gets canceled. It gets censored.
Oh, back to the conspiracy theory. Remember, claiming that the truth is being hidden, so that's why you don't have any evidence, isn't actually evidence. And you still need the evidence. But now you also need evidence of the conspiracy.
He said few are aware of the great number of mammal species found with dinosaurs. Paleontologists have found 432 mammal species in the dinosaur layers.
Yeah, that seems plausible, but I'm not going to look it up, as I don't really care.
432? I believe there's only a little over 500 dinosaur species that have been found.
I think it's closer to like 700, if you don't count modern birds. But again, I don't really care. There's no magical ratio of Mesozoic mammal species to dinosaur species that will suddenly make the fact that mammals evolved in the Jurassic a problem for evolutionary biology.
So they found almost as many mammal species in those same layers as they have dinosaurs. Not many people hear about that. That can be looked up statistically, but it's not something they put on the evening news.
Yeah, because here's about the most impressive Mesozoic mammal, Repenomamus. And it was indeed covered in the news. But let's compare it to Titanosaurus. Which of these do you think is going to get more media coverage? Probably the one the size of a building, and not the one the size of a dog. And remember, all other Mesozoic mammals are even smaller, and generally only known from very fragmentary remains, often just teeth. The media want clicks and subscriptions, so they're not going to spend time on things people are unlikely to care about, and that includes the next shrew-sized jaw fragment of a multituberculate mammal found in the Cretaceous. It's not a conspiracy, it's just basic economics. Companies do the things that get them money.
Because people might ask the question, how in the world can that be if they evolved at different times?
And then they'll be told the very obvious answer, that the evolution of a group does not require the extinction of another group. Nothing about mammals evolving requires that dinosaurs go extinct, although it did take the extinction of most dinosaur groups for mammals to be able to evolve to fill megafaunal niches.
Then he said these include nearly 100 complete mammal skeletons.
There are almost no complete skeletons in the fossil record of any kind, let alone of small animals, so I find this hard to believe. But if it's true, then it should be really easy to tell which animal is a Mesozoic primate, or whatever the particular claim is that the skeleton is supposed to support, so that the claim can be assessed. But it's weird that we keep hearing just vague terms, and only one citation that I had to go digging for, and which didn't really say anything that would help Kindell or Werner's case.
But where are these fossils?
Museum collections, probably.
We visited 60 museums, but did not see a single complete mammal skeleton from the dinosaur layers displayed at any of these museums.
Yeah, museums typically only display the stuff people will come see, because the display aspect of the museum is the public-facing, money-making arm. If you want to see specimens that aren't of much public interest, like the skeleton of a rat-sized Jurassic mammal, you're going to have to look at the specimen storage area of the museum. But that's a thing you can do. I've been in museum storage and fossil prep areas. I just asked nicely. It's not really that hard to do. You can ask, and chances are that if the staff can accommodate you, someone can escort you to see the fossils that aren't on display. You might have to set up a day in advance to do it, and you might want to contact the museum director, but it's a thing you can do.
Now, a complete vertebrate skeleton from the fossil record is incredibly rare. Therefore, every example should be on display in some museum everywhere.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
Yet here they have nearly 100, but they weren't put on display.
Look, the last time I went to a museum with fossils in it was when I was in the LA area, and Vishanti and I went to some museums there. Now, Vishanti is a friend of the channel, a personal friend, and a smart person, but she's not exactly a paleontology enthusiast the way, say, I am. You know what she wanted to do? Go see the dinosaurs. Sure, she looks at some other stuff like big marine reptiles and a mounted baleen whale skeleton, but she wasn't there to look at tiny mammal skeletons. Indeed, one of her biggest takeaways was just how big ceratopsians could get and how some of them had skulls taller than she is. Humans like big, impressive things. That's why giants might be the most common cross-cultural legendary creatures. But there's a world of difference between not putting something on valuable museum floor real estate and hiding it. These mammal fossils are not hidden, they're openly published on, and if you really want to see them, you can. It just takes effort.
Why? Because people would ask very embarrassing questions like, what are these advanced mammals doing with dinosaurs when they weren't supposed to exist at that time and were not supposed to have evolved for millions of years later?
No, that's not why. It's because they probably wouldn't ask questions about them at all and would just ignore them, and even potentially not bother going to the museum if they can't see what they came for. But even if they did ask those questions, the easy answers are that they're not particularly advanced and no one ever said that these mammals only evolved much later. That's just something creationists seem to have made up.
Doesn't that fatally weaken the theory of evolution? Well, yes, of course it does.
I'm sorry, but the fact that people are wrong about when mammals evolved and that other people lie about what mammals are found in the stratigraphic column isn't a fatal wound for the theory of evolution. It's just people being ignorant, sometimes willfully so. That's something that has been going on for as long as there have been humans, which is a couple orders of magnitude longer than Kindle thinks the universe has existed, because he happens to be one of those ignorant people, and almost certainly one of the willfully ignorant types.
And that's why it is canceled, that's why it is censored.
Publishing about these finds in literature is literally the opposite of the finds being censored.
As it says in Romans chapter 1,
I couldn't possibly care less for the purposes of this discussion what it says in any part of the Bible. It's a scientific empirical evidence or get out kind of deal here. After this, Kindle launches into an extended thing about how evolution contradicts his interpretation of the Bible. It clearly does, and that's a problem for his interpretation of the Bible, and I don't care about that fact. Which I guess means we should end the video here. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, then please hit like on the video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Van Tovend, Ferrevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, Elleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek von Mennen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, and Volus. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.